Hi, I'm Miriam Friedlander, City Councilwoman. This is Manhattan at Large, and I'm here. I'm from the Lower Manhattan area, but we're here for a very special reason tonight, and that is sort of celebration or letting everybody know this is the year of International Women's Day. And we think of it in 1908, starting here in our country, and here we are in 1978, 70 years, and we wonder what's happened in those 70 years. We have a wonderful group of guests, and they're going to give us an idea of how it all started right down here on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and what's happened in the interim, and perhaps tell us a little bit about what we're looking forward to. I'd like to introduce Noreen Connell here, and she is president of National Organization for Women, New York chapter. Right? Nice to have you, Noreen. And then we have here Adrienne Critchlou, and she's international representative of the Communication Workers of America, AFL-CIO. That's a long title, isn't it, Adrienne? It's a lot to carry, isn't it, huh? Okay. Well, we know that you can carry it, so that's important. And then we have somebody else very special here who's been around the trade union movement for a long, long time, and a very good old friend of ours coming from the Lower East Side. And she's Connie Kopelov, and she's education director now of 1199, the National Union of Hospital Healthcare Employees. She was with Amalgamated for a while, yeah? The long history.
A long
there?
while.
A long one there. All right. But you know she knows a lot about it. And then, of course, we have somebody very special who's been participating with the women for so many years now. Not too many years, hasn't been actively in this period. But she is Goldie Chu, and she's member of the Asian American Women's Caucus and been very well participating in so many things we've been doing lately. You know, you just saw a slide there that was a very special International Women's Day commemoration. I had a resolution that I introduced in the City Council, about a month ago, that asked the City Council to ask our mayor to recognize that International Women's Day started here in our city. And because of that, and because of the tremendous history of it, would he recognize it and declare it so in New York City? And he answered, he says, yes, Miriam, I will. So there we were, and that's the slide you saw, in the Blue Room in City Hall. And many women from all over the city, active women, women from groups and organizations, women who had participated in the history of New York City were there to see him read the proclamation. And more than that, it was 1908 to 1978, and 78 was marked by the people you saw there. There was Bella Abzug, and there was Carol Bellamy, and they were giving him what is so important in 78, and that is the Program for Action for Women that came out of Houston, Texas, the International Women's Year program, with thousands of women prepared for it. So here we are to talk about the beginning and where we are now. And for those who are watching us and would like to ask questions about what we're doing, there is a phone number, you know. It's 734-9888. And you can call and ask as we move along so that you can participate with us in this celebration of International Women's Year. I think, how about it, Connie? You want to start the story now?
Well,
what happened? How did we get into this idea of an International Women's Year?
I have to start the story earlier. And
Oh,
I think
you do?
New York has a very proud history
Uh-huh.
of women, the activity of women in unions.
Right.
The first women's union in this country was established in New York City in 1825.
In the whole country?
The New York Tailoresses. They were the first, right here in our own city.
Uh-huh.
And it's funny, in those days, the first factories, of course, were women and children, in the textile mills in New England.
No men there?
Very few men. Men were still needed to do all that work of clearing the ground. They didn't, but they found this useful work so the kids and the women wouldn't get in any trouble.
Oh, I see.
And they could go work for, you know, endless hours in the mills and sewing, as women have always done. So I wanted to go back a little earlier because that's where our beginnings are. And it's interesting, as some of us today in all the groups that we represent work together, that we recognize that women and unionists in 1820s and 30s were talking about female oppression.
Oh, no.
And mounting stumps and making flaming speeches
Where,
about
in
the rights
New
of
England?
women. In New York, and New England, and everywhere that they were organizing. So it goes back a long time.
What were they asking for when they organized in unions then? I mean, today we're talking what, 8-hour day? No, no more, are we?
I don't think so.
No? What
I
are we
think it's
talking
still a
about?
problem. I still think, you know, women sometimes work overtime and they don't get paid for it because they're supposed to love the job so much, of course.
But overtime means how many hours today?
Overtime over 8, of
Over
course,
8.
you know.
What did overtime mean then?
There really wasn't any overtime. It wasn't until
Was it kind of a sun up to
they
sundown?
began to fight for 12-hour day.
Days.
What?
12-hour days they began to fight for, and then
Right.
eventually 10-hour days.
Right.
And I think many of the struggles that produced International Women's Day were around the struggle for legal limitation on hours. It was very hard to organize, to unionize. They were incredible women who led some of these unions. And even as we come up to the history since 1908, when International Women's Day was again celebrated, it was often the women who walked out first. They walked out first in Chicago, in the men's clothing plants. They were the 20,000, the uprising of the 20,000 in the ILG in 1909, 1910. Women,
Where was this?
New York City.
In New York City. Was this in the area, you know, was this around where the triangle?
Fire.
Yes.
Fire was
Is that it? What was it about?
Our neighborhood.
Your old
Miriam?
neighborhood, the one that you're in right now.
Where I am now, where I represent,
you
and we still
represent
have the
right now.
triangle there, and we still have the buildings?
You still have them. We had a demonstration in commemoration of that last year. Many of us and our organizations participated in that to, again, never let it be forgotten. It were women that really led the fight to get our children out of those mills. Talked about getting down to a 12-hour day. They had talked about things like safety.
Safety.
You know,
What
locked
happened in
doors.
that fire? Anybody know how many people went in that one?
146 women were killed.
146.
And it's interesting,
Mostly young people?
Triangle was not organized. If they had been union, if they'd won a union there, they would not have been working, perhaps, on Saturday when the
Is
fire
that when
took
it
place.
took place?
But they had also nailed the doors shut because they didn't want the women to pilfer. So, of course, they had nailed shut all the fire exits. So the women had to jump out of the windows, and that was what was so horrifying. I read a long story by a suffragist, and she was walking by and saying, what's happening here? And they said, the women are jumping out of the windows, dying, and many of them were able to crawl away, but they were bringing up children, the sole supports, and there was a big relief fund, spearheaded by feminists, by the way, in New York City to try and get their families something to eat, because at that time they didn't even have any insurance program. Someone died, that was it. I mean, that's part of the
Just
human
made a collection
decency.
for the burial
Yeah, that's
in
right.
the community. and
They
that's
were
what
organizing around human
You know,
decency.
the-
Interesting.
They were
that
locking the
even
organizers
then,
out.
Even then, and here it is 1978, and you still find people perpetrating that myth that we're talking about second incomes, we're talking about going to Europe. I mean, when's the
You mean
last
those
time you
women
went to
were-
Europe, Goldie?
Right.
You know, and what we're doing the same thing now that we were doing more than 70 years ago, Mary.
Well, you know, you
We're
just remind
supporting
me of that
families.
because when you were talking about, we talked about sweatshops, aren't
Right.
we? You know, where they locked them in and made them work all kinds of hours and all kinds of conditions. They fried. Goldie, I bet in your area where you live now, you have a similar type of sweatshop.
Well, I think that of the 1,000 garment workers that we have in New York City, I was told that there's 260 within the Chinatown area where they contract for work. And my daughter, who's 13, tells me that her classmates run into the garment factories after school to help their mothers. They're not mandated, they're not forced to do it, but they want to help their mother so that
What, do they do piecework? Is that it?
Yeah.
And they help?
Yeah, straight sewing, turning belts,
And-
sewing taps on, whatever.
I heard that some of the women also bring the babies with them and put
no,
them.
babies are not there anymore.
Not anymore.
Not
huh?
anymore.
Not
How
like
did you
the
put a
past.
stop to that one?
Instead, they've been taking their babies to, now the daycares have been cut tremendously. They've been taking them to neighbor women who think nothing of having 6, 8 babies all in front of TVs and just
Sitting there and
yeah,
letting go.
just to sit there.
Uh-huh. And that's because we've cut down some of the programming in the
yes.
city on
Oh, yes.
daycare and things
we
like
don't
that.
have
so
enough
that-
daycare programs.
Uh-huh, right. Well, what would you say has happened now? Here we are 70 years later, and we had the fight there for the condition. Has anything happened in that interim to women conditions? Aside from what's happened, I think average union people have been fighting for an 8-hour day. We kind of got that, didn't we?
I think, yes, we got the 8-hour day. I think the problem now is to find an 8-hour day.
Oh, is that it?
That's right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the participation of women in the workforce in New York City has gone down. It's way below the national average now.
What?
I think it's because, as everybody sits and says, oh, goody, we don't have as many workers anymore on the city payroll. They forget that those are clerks in the offices, they're child care workers, they're
workers.
paraprofessionals, they're hospital workers.
Uh-huh.
And I would also argue that this country has traded off the apparel industry, and that's the #1 employer in our city.
I see.
And women are losing their jobs. Men are also losing their jobs.
But what are the conditions now in the shop itself? Do you have any idea?
Well, that really depends upon the shops you go into, Miriam. I mean, Goldie's, she's
I mean, that's
giving you a pretty,
is that characteristic of all the shops in the ILG? No, I don't.
Well, I can't speak for the ILG, but the progress, of course, has been tremendous. And if you ever go to a retiree group of trade unionists and you hear the workers, and they're mostly women in that industry, talk about what it was like when they first went to work
Yeah.
and what it was like when they retired, and whoever thought that we would have these conditions, that we would have vacations, that we would have health care and clinics and hospital insurance and 8-hour
And
days,
Social Security.
all of the things, and a
And the
retiree
vote.
program and a pension.
And you can vote.
I
vote. In 1908, in International Women's Day, besides better working conditions, the women were there demanding the vote.
Right.
And a lot of women workers were really at the forefront of that struggle. I think today there's still many more struggles to go through to end discrimination, to really improve the situation on the job, and to get, I think, democracy in the workplace is very important for women not covered by unions. The horror stories that now gets every day from women who've been fired because their boss doesn't like the way they, comb their hair. And we have to say, listen, there's no law that says that you can't be fired except for just cause. You win that through a union contract. And I still think there's a lot of work to do. It came out in Houston. We have to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. And it's difficult because the economy is not booming. We're in a sort of recession. We have been for a number of years. But again, I think women are tough. I mean,
Well, look, we've
We're
talked about the
tough
women
people.
in some of the private industries, ILG shops and some of the other shops, nurses. They've improved their lot some, haven't they? I mean, they've had a hard fight there,
well,
haven't
they've had a hard fight there. Even in the public sector, I think women have really been shafted. And that's not just New York City, that's every level, Miriam.
In people working for public functions or
Yeah,
government or things
sure.
like that? Why would you think?
Well, I think if
Everybody
we-
has
if
the
we-
illusion if you're on civil service,
yeah,
you're
well,
flying high.
it's
You're using
interesting,
up all the
Miriam.
city's money. Didn't you know that?
I happen to be one of those people that some years ago took a cut in salary because I said, gee, I'm going to have security.
Yeah, right.
So I won't have to
See,
worry
that's
because I did come out of the city government.
Uh-huh.
And it's interesting that you have to get there and really, really, really fight to understand that there's no such thing as job security.
Not even in government?
Not even in government.
Not even in civil service?
I mean, how many civil service workers did they find necessary to let go? And how many
about
of them?
60,000 in the last 3 years.
And let's talk about what this does
How
to
many
the
are women
services
among those
and
60?
how many are
Yeah.
women.
Yeah, how many
You
of
know,
those are
how
women?
many women are working in paraprofessional areas where there just wasn't enough money to keep them there, or in the hospital services? I mean, you don't need it. It's all right to have a dietary aide go out and serve 100 sick people, and she knows that 75 of those things are going to be cold
Oh, wow.
when she gives them. I mean, there's nobody
And
in the
then
hospital to do
they
it.
blame the woman who's doing the service,
Well,
right?
of course, that's who they see. Unfortunately, the citizens of New York City who don't work for the government forget. Municipal employees, for the most part, certainly the low-paid ones, are New York City residents, which means they pay taxes on 3 levels. It means that they are subject to be laid off because there just isn't enough money, and we don't
Right.
need the services, because if we don't have the business, who are we going to service?
That's true.
And I
right.
think we have to look at what these
Noreen,
things
you've
mean.
done some special studies, haven't you,
Yeah.
about women in city government?
That's
or in
right.
government as
And
well?
one thing I want to start off with a lot of people don't recognize is that women, in terms of the labor force employed by the city, we're only 27%.
Oh,
of
didn't I
the
hear
employees.
somewhere we're 51.3% of the population?
Exactly. And we're over 40% of the labor force in general. But
In
for
general.
city government, city
Yeah.
government employees, women make up only 27%.
Where do
and
we
we've
lack?
been dropping.
At what level do
Oh.
we lack?
Listen, on all levels. I think there are 2 main problems, and that is women tend to be clustered overwhelmingly in the lower civil service ranks. But also,
Is that because we want to stay there?
oh,
We feel comfortable
No,
there?
not
Let
exactly.
us be mommies, you know,
Shall we
and
be?
take care of the
Yeah,
kids.
where we
and-
take
Right.
care of everybody else in
coffees
the
and-
office and serve the coffee?
Suffer. That's right. But
Is
I
that why
think,
we-
I think there's another reason, and that
What's
is
that?
job tracking. You come, you want a job for the city. If you're a secretary, if you're hired as a secretary, you start out at $8,500, or that
Oh,
was the
that's
salary
a
for a
cent
while.
these days,
Okay.
especially if you're raising a couple of
That's
kids.
right. You have to have a high school degree, and you also have to be able to type, etc. Now, women are directed overwhelmingly to clerical occupations in the city. Now, then there are overwhelmingly male. And if you look at those salary scales there, garbage collectors start out at $11,500.
But no woman's ever directed to take a garbage
That's right.
collector's exam.
That's right. No woman is
What
is
would happen
directed
if she
for
walked
maintenance.
in to ask for that exam?
Huh? I think there's harassment. I think frequently also women are not informed. It's through the network, through the grapevine. Women are intimidated from seeking these positions, and the city itself has not set itself up as a sort of sex-blind, employer. Instead, it follows private industry, saying, "Well, you'd be much happier here with $2,000 or $3,000 less," and not opening up different avenues and different approaches. In California, there's been a lot of that. You see a lot of women, who are now maintenance women. But that keeps our salaries down too, because
I was just
we
going to
are-
ask Goldie about this. For instance, Goldie, if the
I'd
Chinese...
like to pick up
Yeah,
on what
go ahead.
Noreen just said, because I
Right.
think it starts even before then in the schools. There's definite tracking in the schools where kids are not encouraged to seek higher positions. Certainly the girls, if they're medically inclined, God forbid they should be encouraged to be a doctor. If at best a
We used to
practice
be the
practical
doctors in
nurse.
this society. We were the doctors on the frontier.
Yeah.
They took it away from us.
Except that in the schools,
true.
in the schools today, young women are not encouraged to go to school. In my days, I thought it was, an accepted fact. I was lucky to get out of school and then work a couple of years and then get married. Today, they're still doing that. They're still doing that to the kids, and they're saying, well, go to Central Commercial High School. There's nothing wrong with the school, but supposing the young woman has aspirations to go higher and she has the ability to go higher, what then? We want her to be an executive assistant, you know,
Right.
that's terrific.
And it's still happening in the city
The Girl Friday
government.
concept,
Yeah.
is that what
Yeah.
Exactly, and that
set up?
exists in the
Yeah.
city government. And
In
the
the
thing
city
about
government
that
too?
is that I am not paying the salaries of X corporation. However, it's my tax dollars, right, that's going in to city government, and I feel that it should be sort of a step higher than private industry in terms of not being discriminatory either on the basis of sex or
But
race.
doesn't the city government say that it's not discriminatory?
That is true. On the
I
other
mean,
hand,
what's this
yeah.
between the word and the deed?
And the deed. And I think there's the same sort of secrecy network stuff that happens in the city government. One of the things that we'd like to see, there's a new coalition of groups called the New York City Women's Lobby.
Where have I
And-
heard that before?
Yes.
Spend all the time in my office on it.
Yeah, and surprise, many of us here are part of it.
I know, it's
right.
a beautiful
It's a
development.
great.
We'll talk about
thing.
that later, okay?
And one of the things we would like to see is job posting. Now that's
Right.
done in private industry. There's no reason why you can't hear that. Oh, a supervisory position is going to open up,
Hey.
but they don't want to post.
Right.
They-
I wanted to ask Goldie something before when we were talking about the differential between women and men in the jobs, you know. And we say they've come a long way since 1908 and the 12-hour day and 10-hour day. But for instance, if a Chinese woman went looking for a job, she'd be directed to this sweatshop, right? Whereas the men would be directed to a restaurant to be a waiter,
right.
right? Who makes more money on the job, generally? Is there a higher pay for the
It really
restaurant
depends.
work?
Okay, in the restaurant, I believe if they're a good chef, they can command a halfway decent salary.
But I'm speaking the ones who are the waiters and things like that. Do they work on a higher scale than the people working
No,
in
they
the
do
shop?
not. No, they do not. No, that's the reason why there is a need for the double breadwinner in the Chinese families.
Ah, so the women are working
Oh,
there
yes.
because they have
Oh,
to
yes.
In most
Yeah.
families.
in all of
Yeah.
in most of those
That's
families.
not very restrictive, Goldie.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Is that true in other
Absolutely.
communities?
Oh, it
Yeah.
certainly is. You know, Mary, it's amazing the fallacies that we're finding, and,
Yeah.
and they're coming to pass. And I have to say that maybe I'm sensitized to a different point of view because I am a minority. But it's
Thank
interesting to
goodness
me.
somebody
You know,
is
thank good we have
sensitized
we
to
have to
these points of
understand
view.
this. We tend to believe that, oh, poor me, you know, and poor us, and then we find out about the welfare rolls. And you mean they're not all black? You know,
See?
it took us,
You mean
and
more of them
coming
are
out of
white?
working for social services.
That's what I heard. Only
I
20%
began-
of minorities on
Absolutely,
welfare rolls.
Absolutely.
And even
And
among the women who have children, only 20% are minorities.
somebody would really be interesting to know, and they talk about the black matriarchs. I think we should start taking a look at how many white mothers
Right.
are raising children by themselves.
Uh-huh,
Astronomical.
Right.
The difference is that the white establishment can afford a legal separation or divorce at one point in time. Minorities, in all probability, you have two breadwinners because it takes two breadwinners to put bread on the table. We don't have time to go and get another job to pay for a legal separation. I mean, you know, you
There's
just...
a point there. I can understand that. By the way, I'd just like to remind our viewers that if you want to get into this, and this is getting more and more interesting as we go along, there is a phone number you can use, and this is 734-9888. 734-9888. And you may have a point of view you wish to express, or you might want to say something about what's happening in these 70 years between 1908 and 1978 on International Women's Day. Did we tell you that we had the official celebration on March 8th down in City Hall in the Blue Room? I think I forgot the date, but there we are. Well, let's get back to this, what's happening to women now in this interim period. Did the union organizing through this period involve women? I mean, I know a lot of the men went out. Did more and more women get involved in this organizing and working conditions and things?
Certainly the early struggle in New York before the First World War,
Right.
the women were very much a part of that struggle. They were leaders in the struggle. There was, as I said, the uprising of the 20,000 shirtwaist workers
Yeah.
who marched and struggled, and there was an organization then in the women's movement, the Women's Trade Union League, which was a combination of working class women and leisure class women, and they were tremendously valuable to each other.
Right.
And maybe later we can talk about, you know, the variety of organizations we have now. Working women have their own organization, the Coalition of Labor Union Women, but we're forging all kinds of alliances in a
Right.
somewhat different way than back in 1903, 1910, 1920, but with many of the same goals of working together.
Did women find it easy getting into unions?
The history
Am I
will
being
show
naive?
you that
I believe it depends a little bit on the industry.
on the industry.
I
Is
don't
that
think
it?
you can
What happened in the
generalize.
different places? I just wondered whether they faced
Well,
the same.
it's true that many unions just did not want to organize women.
Why? Though
I
must
have to say,
they always said,
really
well, that
don't-
woman
they-
isn't going
they-
to stay on the
yeah,
job.
they
She
really
goes home
don't
and have a kid
understand.
or
You know,
something.
it was always a temporary situation. So it was projected by the
Who said it was
establishment.
temporary?
Men. You know.
Did the women think
Men.
it was temporary?
Not those that were working.
Ah,
Not ever those that were working.
Some of them will have the illusion that I'm going to get out of this,
yeah.
and I'm not going to stay here forever, and I think that had an impact on their own attitudes. But the early labor movement was not interested in organizing unskilled workers. They were first trying to organize the skilled workers, and those were men.
Carpenters.
That's true.
Well,
Leather workers.
some women were skilled workers. I think the overtime restrictions threw many women out. There's a negative side to some of the trade union organizing in terms of how it impacted on women, and it's a very
I'm
positive
talking about
side.
turn of the century kind
I
of.
am too.
Right.
There wasn't any
So would you
overtime.
say that most of the
There were- no,
unions
not
now
overtime, but,
recognize the role of women in there?
1920.
I would definitely think so.
Oh,
Huh?
yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Enough to let them go on up into leadership?
I think what's happening now, Miriam, is that you know, we had the vote, and after we had the vote, it really did take women, because they didn't give us the vote and then say, well, here, now you can really participate. They said you could vote. That's all they said you could do.
All right, well, let's
what-
leave it at that for a moment, because I think we're going to find out, once you got the vote and you started yelling, you started getting into the unions, we're going to find out what's happening now when we come back after a break that we're going to have in this program. But I would like to remind the viewers that you have one of the most interesting and knowledgeable groups of women here who are talking about how we started on International Women's Day. The trade union women, or those who wanted to be in union, went marching for their rights against 12-hour days for a vote, right?
They're
We won a
absolutely
lot of
separate.
those things, but now we have a whole new series of problems. So I would like to tell you, we have here with us Adrienne, and we have Noreen, and we have Goldie, and we have Connie, and I'm Miriam Friedlander, City Councilwoman, and we'll be back after the break.
The National Organization for Women was founded in 1966 in Washington, D.C. It has grown since then to more than 700 chapters and has close to 60,000 members. The New York chapter of NOW is located at 47 East 19th Street, New York City 10003. Their phone number is 674-8950 for further information. The New York City Women's Lobby is a broadly based, newly formed advocacy coalition which is currently made up of over 40 activist, grassroots, feminist, and professional women's organizations, and women in elective office. This is the first issue-oriented women's coalition that is united citywide. For further information, write the New York City Women's Lobby, 60 West 13th Street, New York City 10011, or contact Jan Levy at 595-9750. In accordance with the observance of International Women's Year proclaimed by the United Nations, President Carter appointed a national commission which adopted a plan of action at the National Women's Conference held at Houston, Texas in November 1977. For your copy of the National Plan of Action, write to the National Commission on the Observance of International Women's Year, P.O. Box 1567, Washington, D.C. 20013. A suggested donation of 65 cents per copy would be appreciated to cover the costs of printing and mailing. Next week on Manhattan at Large, council members at large Stern and Olivieri will be discussing the progress of the current city labor negotiations. Their guests will be members of the union negotiating teams.
Hi, this is Miriam Friedlander again. I'm City Councilwoman in Lower Manhattan. I'm having a very exciting discussion with my guests here about International Women's Day. We started sort of officially in New York City in the Lower East Side when 20,000 women walked around the Lower East Side in protest against 12-hour days. Wow. Who'd work that long these days, except councilwomen sometimes. Right? Okay. Or staff, union staff members, is that it? Okay. Well, the wonderful people with me here are, here we are. We have Noreen Connell, who from New York Now, and we have Connie Kopelov here, or we have Adrienne Critchlou sitting over in this chair, and she's the international representative of the communication workers, AFL-CIO, and Connie there, Connie Kopelov, who is now the education director of 1199 hospital workers, and we have Goldie Chu here, who is with the Asian American Women's Caucus, and she's a hardworking woman in her own right, family and all. So here we go. And we've been talking about International Women's Year, and we talked about the slide that you saw before, and that was taken down at City Hall on March 8th, and this was the mayor declaring International Women's Year. If you'd like to get into this discussion, you can call 734-9888. 734-9888, and you can be part of the discussion as to what women are doing in this International Women's Year, which is 1978. Because after the mayor read the proclamation declaring that day New York International Women's Day, the former Congresswoman Bella Abzug, who was president of the International Women's Year Commission, gave the mayor a copy of the action program. And this is the National Plan of Action that came out of the International Women's Year Conference in Houston. And alongside was our president of the City Council, our own Carol Bellamy, who headed the New York delegation. Now, all of this didn't just start in Houston, did it?
No, it started a
No,
long
that started
time.
long before Houston, right? You were saying something about that, Adrienne. How did we all get started on this international conference down in Houston, which took place in November? Right.
Well, for us in New York, up in Albany, in July we had our New York, our Albany conference.
Oh, was that a madhouse? Do you
And,
remember?
Well,
Women stood in line for 7 hours.
after Albany, I'll tell you, Miriam, Houston was a snap.
It sure was. It sure was.
Somebody tell me a little bit about Albany.
What did we end up having? About 12,000.
How many did you
Uh,
expect?
12, 13,000.
We expected 3.
3,000.
3,000.
Expected.
Just this amazing network of women who started saying, hey, because they had very little money to work on.
Right.
And to get the word out and to run out of money for printing, and we said, who's going to show up? It'll
Right,
just be
yeah.
us. And then, boom, everybody shows up all at once. And of
dam
course,
broke.
we
The
ran out
dam
of
broke.
food.
And we had to resort to a paper ballot, and people were
Oh, the election.
standing in line for 7 hours.
Lines.
But why did everybody want to come to Albany? I mean, after all, just women talking to each other. What was the meaning of all this?
You know, Miriam, I
Right.
think that New York, and as of other states and territories, everyone takes the attitude, oh, that women's stuff.
Right.
And I think in New York State, preparing for our Albany conference, we realized a long time ago that it was just damn time to make people stand up and understand that we are a woman.
What would
And
you
we
say? Not
are
only are
more
we a
than-
woman, but we're the majority of the people.
Absolutely, and it's absolutely time that we assert this power and that we understand this system and that we do more than vote.
What does this mean, that all women feel that way? I mean, would all of them pick up and go to Albany? But
If they did, I wouldn't have to work 12, 13,
Yeah.
14, 16 hours a day.
But I think if a lot of women had known, I mean, it was 13,000 with no printing and very little publicity.
right.
If there had been
what kind of
one
women
spot,
came up there?
the greatest diversity I've never seen. Ukrainian women would pop up, and I'd turn around, there would be a Native American, and I'd turn around there, and there'd be
Senior
someone
citizen.
across the way where I live, Upper West Sider. So I think there was an amazing
Did they
diversity.
come from all over the state?
all over?
Oh, yes.
They had rural
Yes.
women.
I
Even
saw
had
a
'em from
tremendous number of
reservations.
Asian women
We
there.
had
Were they
a
merely
good
Chinese, or were they?
80 some odd Asian women. We had Filipino women,
Uh-huh.
Japanese women, Korean women there. And our senior citizens were just absolutely terrific.
Yes, I saw them come up there.
Yeah,
You brought
yeah,
them up.
They were
with-
very, very excited to be part of this women's.
Had they ever been part of a movement like this? I mean, after all, they had the staid
Well-
Chinese culture of a woman in the home. and-
Well, I'm not so sure about that.
Oh,
Because,
is this a
yeah,
wrong impression we
yeah,
have?
it sure is.
See?
Another myth.
There we go. Another myth hits the dust. What
Right.
tell us about it, Goldie?
I think that the senior citizen centers today have really filled the void where the women no longer have to, take the back seat. They've been holding some leadership roles in these centers, and they've been planning programs with their other people. They've planned trips to see the fall foliage and
Right.
cherry blossom.
Isn't this kind of a new part of our women's movement? That that the women have been living longer, and that they're a major part of our senior population, which is so active and so important now.
It's not just because of my hair. I think the Gray Panthers are terrific.
Oh, yes.
Weren't they a very active part of organizing in these?
But I think, my union, 1199, has a beautiful mural across the front
Yeah.
with a quote from Frederick Douglass that says, "Without struggle,
Uh-huh.
there's no progress."
Right.
And I think what we've seen is struggle, and we're continuing to struggle, and we're seeing progress. This whole network would never have come about if there hadn't been the last 10 years of activity by women in all walks of life.
Right.
And
I would say that Albany, the women's movement is no longer a small group of women, and there were older women.
I mean, we
there
no
were
longer
black
have
women.
just the superstars
There
or the
were
elected
always
politicians.
a lot of women
or-
involved, but a lot of the older women who came, a lot of the Asian women who came, everyone who came felt it's my movement too. And to sort of backtrack on why so many women came to Albany, who really didn't know that much. I mean, there wasn't any publicity because there was a struggle going on. And that struggle was what women wanted. That famous question that Freud asked, what do women want?
Right.
Well, what we do want was clarification that women want child care, and they want the Equal Rights Amendment, and they want the right to choose to have abortion or not. They want affirmative action. And there's been, over the last 3 years, a lot of confusion, and I think there's been a lot of hidden anger among women. They may not identify themselves as being a feminist or part of the women's lib movement, but they sure as hell want the same things that feminists are fighting for. And I think a lot of them came up to say,
Yes.
I'm going to put my vote right here.
Is that
That's why
Yeah.
13,000
What
showed
about
up.
all these different cultures that came? Were they able to communicate, or were they resentful of each other? I mean, or anything else? For instance, I heard a lot of Spanish being spoken there, and they came from all over the state,
Cómo no?
you know? Huh?
Yes, yes.
Right? And I heard there were a lot of black people up there.
A lot of
and
confusion. I think everybody helped. I felt like I had been in some war, not ideological battle or anything else, but I had survived the food and the accommodations. And so even on the way back, I was talking to some right-to-lifers who are opposed to legal abortion.
Oh, they were up there too,
Yeah,
weren't they?
yes, and quite a bunch of them there. But it was like we had survived.
What
you know?
came out of it? Let's find out. Because after all, this was a prelude to going down to Houston, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
I mean, every state had this, didn't they? A conference on what? And I think every state showed that they had this outpouring of women far beyond what they expected. In other words, it was an idea long past its time. Women were striving and fighting and looking for recognition and equality, and these state But what do you think were the main things that came out of the state conference that people took down with them to the Houston conference? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, I think we came to a realization. Well, more than that, we met each other. Important. We met each other.
I mean, people
And
who
we
are-
met each other, in most cases, for the very first time. And what was even more interesting,
Right.
we were able to share with each other all kinds of anxieties. And that also gave us an outlet to understand that, yes, maybe we are going to reach a certain goal through different avenues, but we're going for that goal.
Do you
There's no
know,
question
you
about it.
remind me that some of the women up in Albany, and particularly those who came from the upstate areas, for the first time had met lesbians, and all of this was this horror story that they were getting from the Right to Lifers and the other people around. And they found themselves, as you say, with shortage of food, shortage of beds and things like that. And here were these other people acting and had the same resentment against shortage of food and standing online, and were organizing, you know, to go out in the forays to find a restaurant that might have some left over. When you say we met each other, they
Exactly what
recognized
I
that they
mean.
were all women?
I think
They
it was
all had similar
very,
problems?
very important, Miriam, that,
Yeah.
This
that
network.
women were
network?
exposed to the so-called lesbian community,
Uh-huh,
and to find out that, you know, that unknown
right.
is not such a horror. It's a woman.
It's a woman.
It's a mother.
A mother, a daughter,
A
child.
worker,
A worker.
a child, a daughter. It's amazing that sometimes it takes the unknown to make us understand this, that every Asian American is not from China,
Right.
that every black American does not have his or her roots
In,
from Mississippi. You know, it
Yeah.
may be from the Caribbean. It may be from the continent of Africa. Could he also be from Australia? And I think it's very important.
it also could have been first generation up here.
How about that?
Okay, fine. We're coming
Or
back into-
17th.
Oh,
Or
that's
17th.
right.
Yes, but it seems to me, I remember that in Albany, people stayed up all kinds of hours and all kinds of nights writing. And then after you wrote it, at
Making
least 50
lists.
people got together to read it.
Going
you
to
know,
different
and
rooms,
to make a decision.
running around.
I mean, was this a lot of wasted time or was it meaningful?
Absolutely
Did
not.
something come out of that? What kind of things came out of it? That's what I'm trying to find.
Well,
Yeah.
I think one of the things that came out of it, and not getting specific on an issue, because I think the issues that we took to Houston were there quite clearly. But I think the most important thing that came out of a thing like our Albany conference was women for the first time learning how to do it. There's no better
organizers.
way. There's no better way.
That was an organizer's dream. I mean,
it
An
was.
organizer's dream?
I came up there with mail bags full of leaflets,
Right.
13,000 leaflets.
Right. What were they about?
And they were about August 27th. It was on the ERA. And I thought, Jesus, how am I going to get rid of all these leaflets?
Right.
They went like this. And
Okay.
one box of ERA grams went in a room, and I realized there are 1,000 people here. But it didn't feel like it was 1,000. You know, it didn't look, you know, we were all so together, and there was so much excitement.
So
There
if
was
you
a lot of
felt
work done, you know, before people went to Albany.
Uh-huh.
People in various organizations would work on resolutions. That
Right.
there were many common concerns. I think ERA was certainly touched
Let's say,
all
we
of
keep
us.
saying ERA, initials. You know,
Oh,
for
yes,
some
Equal
people,
Rights Amendment.
it's an equal rights amendment. Do we need an equal rights?
But I think
All
trade
right.
union women were also concerned about a lot of, you know, economic issues of
Okay. Is a job issue
healthcare,
important for women?
of the chance to have a job, first of all.
Right. They want an equal.
They want jobs. There are not enough jobs in this country.
Uh-huh.
And
As some people say, given a choice between a home and a job, what will a woman choose?
With a
woman-
job, you can get a home. With a home, you can't get a job. Don't forget it.
In other words, you need the training. You need the opportunity. You need the opportunity to train. To
I
have,
was concerned when I went up to Albany with the concept of what Middle America had of an Asian family.
Oh, that's
And do you remember when we were in that workshop, Miriam? You were
Right.
moderating that workshop.
yeah.
I was concerned when this was a workshop in Albany where it was very obvious that they didn't know where the minority people were coming from, and it was an education workshop, and they wanted to reinforce the typical American family, the role of the mother and the father. And I would say that they almost had the vote. Okay, they were going to pass a resolution to reinforce the typical American family with the father and mother role. I have 5 children, and I said, what does my son say when his father doesn't get off at 5 o'clock, he doesn't work from 9 to 5, and doesn't take him fishing on his days off, and I don't stay home to make apple pies? Does that mean that we're not typical American families?
I remember that.
Do you remember that?
Very
And
impressive.
I think that it was,
Not only-
it's something, it's a message that has to come across
throughout the United
Not only
States.
that, but it struck a very responsive chord in many, many people there, and that's why they got throughout
Yeah.
that kind of a destructive approach as to you belong in your place as we categorize you, and you were very constructive. Well, let's move on from Albany. I think Albany created a lot of excitement, a lot of knowledge of each other, a lot of awareness, a lot of sense of pride in being able to organize and to place things on paper and to bring a program down. By the way, I think one of the most important things out of Albany was this beginning to overcome the separation between New York City and upstate. You know, this is like two different foreign lands, you know, and we found out we have similar problems, similar concepts, and we all went together down to Houston. Now, a lot of people say, you know, what was it, $5 million that was gotten to set up this conference down there? Was it worth it? Should it have been? Is it a waste of time? And I'd like to get your feeling about that, because for the first time in my knowledge, money was set aside so that people who could not normally afford to go to a conference, particularly, let's say from New York City to Houston and back and stay at a hotel for 2-3 nights, you know, were being paid to go as delegates. And I thought this was an interesting concept, because that money was set aside in the Congress. I think that was something that Congresswoman Abzug at that time fought for, and a lot of people supported, and we made come through. What's your feeling? Do you feel that
Well,
something happened there?
National Pickle Week costs the United States $3 million every year.
National Pickle Week?
That's right.
I'm impressed.
And
What kind of pickles
the government sets aside $3 million
for pickles?
every year. Now
you
here's
think-
$5 million,
Yeah.
and it's of all the countries in the world after the UN International Women's Year set aside money and money to develop women's programs. So America comes out as one of the lowest countries in terms of the exact investment in money. I mean, Canada is given 3 or 4 times what the United States is. So there are objections to the $5 million, but I think in
You think
perspective,
it was too low?
it helped a lot of low-income women, included a lot of now women who couldn't have made it. They simply could not, and I think it led to the diversity of the program. We couldn't have
I
made
must tell you that when I saw the women coming from Mao, and when I saw the women coming from Alaska, and when they added, every time we would say the 50 states, and they would add, and its possessions, I learned we had possessions whom we were not giving full rights, and those women were there to tell us about it. And it was a fantastic consciousness there.
Well, I was thinking before about the, you know, all of these, the growth of the women's movement and the development of trade union women's organizations and now and Asian American women and so on, that the network is spreading and developing, and we're learning about each other's problems. And trade union women, I have to mention one of the things we're so concerned about, and that we've gotten help from other women's groups, and that is the effort to give women who want the right we all take for granted, that I can go out in a little ballot box and vote whether I want to belong to a union, and my boss has got to recognize me. And we found that 45,000 workers at J.P. Stevens textile plants in the South don't have that right that's given to them by the law. And I think that some of these gatherings have given us a chance to talk about some of these sort of concerns.
Now, you said before, we learned a great deal more about each other when we got there. Would you say that this is one of the greater consciousness we have? You know, we talk about runaway shops from New York City and how this is affecting women's jobs because they're very often in those jobs, and we're losing government workers because we're losing industries. Here we go to a conference in Houston. We find J.P. Stevens won't allow their people to organize, so they pay them lower pay, and that's where the jobs go. How about that, right?
We've lost hundreds of thousands of jobs
in the South.
in the city of New York.
What would happen if the
Amsterdam, New York, Utica, New York,
Those
Right.
used to be
the
large,
carpet center,
booming.
the Utica sheets used to be made in Utica, New York. They're now made down south by non-union
What difference do you
workers.
think a conference like Houston made
Well,
to that kind of
because I
consciousness, that kind of movement?
I think the bringing together the diversity of women, working women, professional women, non-professional women,
Right.
people who are not who work in the home and don't work in a paying job, that we've all learned about each other's problems and learned to help each other.
Hey, I bet that was a new concept also that came out of Houston. A lot of people had. We used to talk about the home worker or the homemaker and such. I know there was a lot of stress down there about the work being recognized in some form.
As work.
As work?
You know that old phrase.
How
my
can you
mother
do
doesn't
that?
work. You know what
She's
does
just
that
a
mean? My mother
housewife.
doesn't.
Yeah.
You know.
Are you
Just-
working are you working now, or are you at home?
I'm just a housewife.
You're just a housewife.
You hear that all
What
the
has
time.
been, what was proposed at Houston to make changes on that level? How do you handle that as work? Somebody tell me. I don't know.
There's one that is displaced homemakers. That was one thing to get centers. So when women re-enter the workforce after their children have grown, their recognition. You know, there's ways, someone there to help them. You know, but I think the other thing is they asked for a reclassification of the occupational handbook, which classifies homemaking, and that affects household technicians too. You know, like teachers of small children, daycare center teachers are on the same level as zookeepers. Same manual skills, same level of intelligence. Now,
Right.
this is a government publication
You're
on
kidding.
no.
Right.
And then what's the skills necessary for keeping a home? It then goes below the zookeeper level to something else. I'm not putting zookeepers down, but I really think that women's contribution both to the home and to any sort of female occupation is so devalued. And it really hits home when you think of the investment women put in.
Do you think that something can be established in which the hours put into homemaking can be established as a wage type thing, as recognition and things of that sort?
Certainly it can be done, Miriam, if we make sure
Yeah.
that we elect lawmakers
Uh-huh.
that are sensitized to the problems of the citizenry of this country.
Ah.
Because we don't,
Since we are a
don't-
major part of the
okay.
citizenry of this country. I mean, after all, we are accepting the idea that women should be paid who are doing housework and coming in and doing it for somebody else.
That's right.
Do you think we need unpaid houseworkers? That's our problem. No. Okay, well, that's certainly one of the questions that's come up for very serious consideration. What are some of the other things that you feel came out of Houston
I
that
think we've
take
got-
us from 7 to 8 and sort of an outlook to the future? Really, the question's been raising, what are the barriers there are to women? Now, we've come a long way. We have a lot more in education. We've broken out in certain of the occupations and the trades and the professions. What are still some of the major barriers as we saw it in Houston, as they were written up and as we projected? You know, we
The
have to move
employment
on.
picture is not good, and I think TV and media perpetuates the myth of the woman executive. The gap between female salaries and male salaries are increasing. In the decade after decade, we lose 3 or 4 points. Women in executive situations, it's really closer to 3%. Women now are getting into college, they're getting into training programs, but we aren't adequately represented, and we shouldn't just focus on the executive woman. We have to think of the blue-collar woman and whether we're supporting the type of organizing that needs to be done so that the pattern of women being in unorganized, industries and men in highly organized industry ends, so that women also have union, benefits.
Right.
There's so many things, and the employment picture is not good. And
Well, I think
I
that
have
certainly
seen-
was a
focused on-
barrier, wasn't it, in the fact that the women are not being allowed to move up in the opportunity, and they're getting differential in pay.
That's
real, isn't it?
Very
Okay,
real.
let me pick one
But
of some of
also,
these
Miriam,
things.
I
There were
just came from a meeting
Yeah.
when we talked about the closing of 4 hospitals, which are 80% women.
Okay.
And this is a country that's the richest country in the world and can't afford adequate health care and can't afford to keep people working.
You know, one of the things that I saw developed there was a nationwide meeting on this, caucus on this, and this was the whole question of battered women and violence against women. I think this is a whole new thing that's being put on the table now, right? This is no longer a question of a shame. This is really an attack. This is cause that can't be allowed, and I think this is something we've done quite a bit in New York, in development of work on battered women, but it's becoming a nationwide action. And that, I know, has come out of Houston, that they are going to project state meetings on that and new legislation on that and such.
I think what was interesting, though, the New York delegation sat right behind the Mississippi delegation.
Yeah,
In front.
And, to vote there, you had to stand up or sit down. And I think what was clear to so many, the big issues there were ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. The other
Choice
one was
abortion.
abortion, the right to choose.
Right.
And then the third was lesbian rights. I think it's interesting when issues like child abuse came up, many of the people in the Mississippi delegation voted against legislation, to prevent child abuse. They also voted against some of the battered wives shelters, those concepts, because you get sort of the philosophy that women, there's no such thing as a battered wife. All
has to be an
there's
accepted way
disobedience.
of
There's
life.
only a disobedient wife. This is Phyllis
So we have a
Schlafly's,
lot of work to do, don't we, to
a lot of
overcome some of those.
way
But
to go.
I was intrigued by that presentation of the four minority resolutions, and I saw them.
Wasn't that beautiful?
Oh, that was just beautiful,
Adrienne?
wasn't it? Standing at 4 different mics, we had the representative. Somebody
Yeah.
want to tell me about that?
Adrienne?
Well,
And we're running time, so
Goldie
let's go
says,
quickly.
But quickly, we did really start that whole minority concept here
Yeah.
in New York, and it was within our delegation, and we did an awful lot of organizing prior to going to Houston.
Who were the minorities?
The minorities?
At the mics.
Oh, at the mics.
Yeah.
We had
I'm running short
we
of time,
had
so I've got to
Asian
get the story
American,
out.
Black, Hispanic, Chicano.
Yeah.
Did I catch us all?
Oh, no, you left
Native
out the Native American
Native-
and the Alaskans were
And
standing
the
there.
Alaskans.
Uh-huh.
What we really did was we went in together
Uh-huh.
and forged something that
You wrote your own
we
resolutions?
we rewrote our own
Wow,
resolutions.
beautiful.
And understanding that we
very
had to
exciting.
sensitize each other that
Uh-huh.
you cannot lump minorities together. And we have to understand and crystallize that our differences are there and they're good.
Uh-huh.
They're absolutely good.
And you learn to respect each other?
I think we taught the white establishment to respect us
As well.
because we did it.
Right.
We did it, Miriam, and I think
know.
it was important that we did it.
Right.
And we moved that whole convention.
Yeah. You know, I often say in the Lower East Side, we're getting away from the melting pot idea. We don't want to lose each other into nothingness, you know, into one lump. And we're all beginning to reassert ourselves, our backgrounds, our individuality, our cultures and such. And perhaps that's one of the things I saw come out of Houston, that there was, as we met together in a tremendous movement in togetherness, the individuality, the creativeness, the cultural background, everything began to stand out, you know, and you became an individual in fulfillment.
That's what we insisted upon
Right.
in the way we
And respect for
presented
each other
our
that way.
minority caucus.
I
think
saw
that's
nobody really destroy each other in that thing, and even these dissident delegations
We were talking.
listened
Yes.
and exchanged and talked, and while they stood up and voted, I think some of these points that are in the Houston program, and I hope everybody will send for them, because there are some very important things being said in this program, and I know you're being given the information on the TV camera, but here's the talk about women in arts and humanities, the question of battered women. Business women were there and talked about it. And then we have women talking about child abuse and child care and credit. Do you know how incredibly difficult it is for women to get credit as individuals? Disabled women, they were a fantastic group, all over the floor organizing, also rewrote their whole resolution and such. And then we have elected women, even I was there, you know, and women on employment and equal rights and health and homemakers and international affairs and media. I can go on. I hope you will send for this, because we've just heard just the beginning of the story from our guests here. And our guests are Adrienne Critchlou, and we have Noreen Connell, and we have Connie Kopelov, and we have Goldie Chu. And I think we have really just started the story of why we have International Women's Day, started in 1908. We're in 1978. And I must tell you, I feel we're just at the beginning. We're on our way, aren't we?
We're
Together.
on our way.
This is Miriam Friedlander. Thank you for being with us this evening. Good night.